Selam Rastafari. Rastafari. Greetings to the listeners. This is going to be chapter 8. This is going to be the first chapter in part 3 of Africa, Judaism, and African Jews. In chapter 8, historical narratives of a Jewish presence in sub-Saharan Africa, linking sub-Sahara with ancient Judaism. So now let's get into more of this important history. From mythical realities to historical metaphors. The Judaizing societies of Africa carry with them the dream of a genesis outside Africa. Beyond realistic general chains, they revert to an ancient past which celebrates the name of an original ancestor. These genealogical dreams stage their arrival in Africa through elements of an original otherness that is both geographical and religious. The primary function of these genealogies being to define the group as non-African. In the absence of recorded African history, the myths of origin of these societies propose a version. In the absence of recorded African history, the myths of origin of these societies propose a version of their past based on the historical presence of Jews in Africa. Since the early Middle Ages, legends disseminated among Jews as well as non-Jews, claiming the existence of Jewish kingdoms in Eastern and Western Africa, gained in popularity and influence. Such genealogies, uncovered by the travel accounts of Eldad the Danite in the 9th century, or Benjamin of Tudela in the 12th century, which still have relevance and resonance for a surprising number of people, are claimed by those in search of a new identity. The accounts of their origin, and particularly their links with Judaism, are fed by mythical narratives according to which their ancestors were the descendants of Abraham and Yaakov, Abraham and Jacob. The remarkable recurrence of some narrative patterns, such as the theme of the lost tribes of Israel, or the arrival of the Jews in Egypt following Jeremiah, after the destruction of the first temple, represents a complex search for origins involving multiple dimensions. For example, ethnic, religious, spatial, historical, social, mythical, linguistic, and more recently genetic. At the same time, these symbolic constructions have proved capable of continuous invention and development in response to new circumstances. Myth constitutes one of the central mechanisms contributing to elaboration of these genealogies. Following Mircea Eliade, I am using the concept of myth, which reveals a living pattern rather than a pure fiction, as a sacred history and therefore a true history, because it always refers to realities and at the same time reveals the eruption of the sacred into the world. In a way, the myth even precedes reality. The psychologist Rollo May writes in his studies of myths in the United States, myth refers to the quintessence of human experience, the meaning and significance of human life. The myth is a drama which begins as a historical event. It takes on its special character as a way of orienting people towards reality. The myth or story carries the values of the society. By the myth, the individual finds his sense of identity. The notion of belonging to the seed of Abraham is a leitmotif in the discourse of groups throughout the world claiming Jewish or Hebrew ancestry or origins. Most marginal Jewish communities, in order to legitimize themselves, make some attempt to show that they have always been Jews and are connected with ancient events and movements of people. So Yemenite Jews maintain that they were the offspring of Jews who migrated to southern Arabia before the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC. In India, Judaism natives of Kashmir, as well as those of Afghanistan, claim that they descended from the tribe of Judah or Manasseh, sent east by Nebuchadnezzar, and that many of them spread through India and the surrounding countries. Judaism Japanese sects claim that their origin is directly traceable to the land of Israel as descendants of the lost tribe of Zebulun. According to the most widespread Bnei Israel tradition, their ancestors have been shipwrecked near the village of Navgeon on the Konkan coast of western India in 175 BC, after they had fled Palestine during the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes. The central myth of origins of the Falasha evokes, in common with Christian Ethiopians, a descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The eminently malleable accounts of lineage developed by African Judaism movements have been attached to the earliest historical hypotheses on the arrival of Jews in Africa. Historians of Africa often write about the place of myth and history in African societies. Myth ruled history and was responsible for justifying it. The earliest Jewish diasporas of Africa can easily provide a foundation for the imagination and identity of these Judaism communities, as Hirschberg points out. Jewish history in Africa, west of Egypt, begins with some wondrous tales of the promise of the land of Canaan to the children of Israel, of the withdrawal of the Tyrians and Sidonians who had controlled the approaches of Egypt to Africa after being expelled from Canaan in the days of Joshua, of David's victory over the Philistine Berber Goliath, of Joab the son of Zeruiah, who pursued the Philistines to the western and southern ends of Africa, of the ships of Tarshish, for example, Africa, of an ancient synagogue erected in the days of King Solomon, of a stone from the Temple of Solomon which was interested in the Griba, the legend and wreathed synagogue of the island of Jerba folk traditions, and stories collected and recorded on ancient times by both Jewish and Gentile, for example, Greek and Arab scholars, or transmitted and written down only in recent generations. Okay, and the author goes on to say, I do not intend to enter into historical details over such a long period and over such a vast region. I have selected from a confusing array of traditions those events that contributed to the understanding of a collective memory. We want to erase the Babylon confusion and get to an understanding or overstanding of a collective memory. My ambition is to disentangle in regions with little written history. History is very important. The true from the likely and the unlikely. If we consider these mythic genealogies that recount an ancient presence of Jews in Africa and the progression into the interior of the continent as a whole, the dispersion from Egypt constitutes one of the major narrative patterns claiming a Jewish presence in Africa. The diffusion from Egypt was variously said to have taken place in the time of the Exodus, when some Jews went south along the Nile instead of toward Israel with Moses, or after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, in the wake of Jeremiah, traveling up the Nile through Sudan to Ethiopia. The book of Jeremias, of Jeremiah, chapter 44, verse 1, mentions several settlements of Jewish colonies in Egypt. Migdol, on a branch of the Nile Delta, Daphne, the former camp of Greek mercenaries, Memphis, the capital city, and last but not least, excuse me. And last but not least, the country of Petrus. Petrus, the Egyptian term for country of the south. The southern province whose capital was Elephantine. The first historical report of the presence of Jews in the area west of Egypt occurred in the context of the controversy of Flavius Josephus against Appian. Josephus notes that during the 3rd century BC, 100,000 Jews were deported from Israel to Egypt. From there, they went to Sarnaca, and probably other countries in northern Africa. They did go to other countries in northern Africa. The harsh repression of the Jewish rebellion against Roman rule marked the end of the spread of Judaism in Sarnaca. The Jews scattered. Some probably wandered toward the Jebel Nafusa in the hinterland of Tripoli. Others toward Egypt, particularly Alexandria and the Maghreb, where they joined existing settlements. One of the hypotheses of a Jewish push toward the Saharan oasis as far as the river Niger is that it was a consequence of the dispersion that followed the Jewish defeat in AD 115 AD. This hypothesis could be combined with the legends of Jewish kingdoms in Africa and numerous variations about the destiny of the lost tribes in the African desert. As we have seen, De La Fosse, situated in Western Africa, one of the phases of the great extension of the Jews, Syrians, ancestors of the Peul, legends attributed the origin of the great empire of Ghana to these refugees. For years, the scholarly consensus was that the Falasha were the descendants of Agar, who came to Ethiopia through Egypt or South Arabia. The case for diffusion through Egypt rests upon the known presence of Jews in Egypt prior to the Exodus and the existence of the Jewish contingent at Elephantine. This settlement allegedly marked the beginning of the extension of Jewish influences toward the interior of the continent. Among the different theories on the question of Falasha origins, the lost tribes' view also usually assumes that the path of migration was through Egypt. If the time and the modes of the appearance of a form of Judaizing religion in Ethiopia among the Falasha remain indeterminable, researchers agree on some elements at the origin of one version of the myth. There were certainly Jews in the south of Egypt whose presence could suggest hypothesis of a diffusion of the Falasha from this region. Historians date the settling of Jewish soldiers in the region of Elephantine back to the middle of the 7th century BC, at the time when Manasseh was freed from his Assyrian overlord and was able to provide mercenaries to Egypt in order to maintain their support. The attractiveness of a theory of diffusion of Jews from Egypt is enhanced by the papyri of Elephantine, which provide information on the type of syncretistic Judaism practiced by the Aramaic-speaking community at Elephantine, comparable to aspects of Falasha practice. But in fact, there is little information on their movements toward the interior of the continent. We know that the garrison of Elephantine was in charge of keeping watch on the southern border, and soldiers were, according to the few available sources, appointed to the escort of caravans toward Nubia, which provided gold, ebony, ivory, animal skins, spices, ostrich feathers, minerals, and slaves. A document mentioned by Porten recounts an expedition in Nubia from Elephantine. A document mentioned by Porten recounts an expedition in Nubia from Elephantine just before the Persian conquest, whose convoy included 30 rowers, 60 Palestinians, perhaps Jews, 15 Syrians, and several Egyptians and Nubians. In conclusion, there is no real evidence either that the Elephantine community was authentically Israelite, or that it had any bearing at all upon the development of the Falasha community or any other African community. At most, it may suggest a new chapter in that history. From the 11th century on, Arab travelers spoke of the existence of Jewish groups in Africa, but the Bilad al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash collections of Arab sources on medieval Western Africa gave little direct information about the Jews. The existence of black Jews, as suggested by Arab authors, would give some historical support to tenuous as it may be, legends of a Jewish kingdom in Africa, to the legends of a Jewish kingdom in Africa. Although Arab authors more or less ignored these minorities, which had no specific significance from their point of view, these are the only documents available before the conquest by the French of the Tuat area at the beginning of the 20th century. Then Arab-speaking French military officers or missionaries collected old documents and attempted to reconstruct local history by questioning the inhabitants. In Bilad al-Sudan, Father Kwak gathered Arab texts from the 8th to the 16th century, covering the area of Western Africa to the west of the Nile and the south of the Sahara. Among the Arab authors, al-Bakri, circa 1014 to 1094, is considered the greatest geographer of the Muslim West, alongside al-Idrisi, circa 1100-1165. The best-known Arab geographer of the Middle Ages, Kitab al-Masalik wa al-Mamalik, the work al-Bakri, finished in 1068, is regarded as one of the best sources on the history of these regions during this period. The work was taken up again in the first third of the 12th century by al-Zurhi's the Geographia. Later on in 1154, al-Idrisi wrote Kitab Rajar at the request of Raja II of Sicily. This work, in addition to the information on itineraries, it provided established an inventory of peoples and their practices from west to east. Incontestably, the best known of the Arab historians and geographers of Africa was Leo Africanus, circa 1492 to 1550, who was born of Arab Muslim parents in Granada and traveled in Africa, visiting Timbuktu and the empires of Mali and Bornu. For many years, the description of Africa was the only source on sub-Saharan Africa and became the major geographical source of knowledge on the continent. Translated in 1556 into both Latin and French, the book had a number of editions in several European languages and carried great authority. It makes frequent mention of Jews in Africa. Leo Africanus tells us that Africans, before being Muslims, had observed the Jewish religion, that there were warrior tribes in the Atlas Mountains claiming descent from King David. This is northern Africa, around the northwest region of Africa. In the Atlas Mountains claiming descent from King David, that the Canaanites traveled to Africa and were followed later by the Sabians, and that the ruler of Timbuktu was the mortal enemy of the Jews. According to some Arab historians, when Arab armies penetrated Berber lands in the 7th century, many of the tribes were Jewish or strongly influenced by Judaism. Ibn Khaldun, the son of Khaldun, another great Arab historian, wrote in the 15th century. It is possible, moreover, that others among those Berber tribes believed in a Jewish religion, which they have received from the Israelites at the time of the expansion of their kingdom to the neighborhood of Syria and the rule over it. This was true of the Jarawa in the Audes Mountains, the tribe of the Kahina, who was killed by the Arabs at the beginning of the conquest. This was true also of the Nafusa in Africa. Guandalauca, Madiuna, Bahlula, and Giata, and the Banu Bazaz in the outermost Maghreb, until the great Idris, a descendant of Hassan ibn Hassan, who shone forth in the Maghreb, wiped out all the remnants of religions and communities that were in this area. One of the most respected of them was the Kahina, Daya, the daughter of Matia, the son of Tifari, Tifan, queen of the Audes Mountains. Her people were of the Jarawa tribe, kings and leaders of the Butur, a group of Berber tribes. Legend recounts that the Kahina was a Jewish Berber queen and a priestess with supernatural powers who was crowned queen of the Maghreb when, at the head of her soldiers mounted on camels, she compelled the Arab general Hassan ibn Numan to retreat. When Ibn Numan came back with enormous reinforcements, the Kahina's prophetic talent allowed her to predict the defeat of her people. She ordered her sons to go over the enemy, and she chose to be killed in action. Later historians all follow Ibn Khaldun's footsteps. Opinion on the historical value of the Kahina story and the Judaization of Berbers are divided. The contribution of these antique sources to reach carried out by French colonial agents from the end of the 19th century encouraged the perception of traces of a Jewish presence in Western Africa. Here we can observe how the myths regarding this presence took root. Jewish groups of the Saharan margins during the Middle Ages. Since ancient times, in the long strip of pre-Saharan territories, which spread from Alexandria to the mouth of the Wadi Dra, local traditions can be found everywhere that attest the ancient existence of sedentary Jewish populations, to whom the introduction of certain techniques might be linked. metallurgy, and well boring. Jews were able to reach the regions of Western Africa, Ghana, Mali, Bornu, and Songhai by settling in important places, trading posts, and markets, through which transmitted the trade from Maghreb to Sudan. The Tariq Lemtani, the earliest trans-Saharan trail, established a link from Fez and Marrakesh to Walata and Timbuktu through the Western Sahara and Mauritania. It eventually created a network that connected with all the great North African centers to Timbuktu. As the new crossroads attracted settlements, it seems that Jews were among them from the first. The usual occupations of these Jews from the southern Maghreb, that is, traders and goldsmiths or silversmiths, brought them into contact with West African populations who provided gold dust. Because Black Africa lacked salt, horses, and manufactured goods, its people exchanged gold and slaves for goods brought by North African traders. Gold extracted from the mines of Senegal, Mali, and the northeast of the Gold Coast was the main object of trans-Saharan trade. In Muslim lands, Muslims were theoretically prohibited from owning or trading in gold. It seems that this is why the Jews were present near production centers, why they took part in the caravans that carried gold, and why coin makers and goldsmiths who worked and sold the gold were often Jews. Michel Abitbol pointed to the presence of various Jewish groups on the Saharan confines before the Middle Ages. Some Jews lived in Takhawust and Golimine, the last two Moroccan posts on the Trans-Saharan Atlantic route before entering the desert. Farther to the east, a small Karaite Jewish kingdom is said to have existed in the Dra Valley until the beginning of the 11th century. Its existence is plausible given the fragmented political situation of the region at the time and the interiority of Jewish traditions in the area. If these Jewish states existed, their economic viability rested on trade with Sudan. If one believes the local tradition, one of the earliest Jewish communities of the area lived in Ifran, where the caravan of the Moroccan Sus left for Senegal. According to legends gathered by travelers, the members of this community claimed that their ancestors came from Palestine via the edge of the Sahara at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. In the Tafila Lilt, Sijil Masa, located at the crossroads between Central Maghreb and Western Sudan, was a city of rich merchants, a hub for trans-Saharan trade. It was fought over by North African dynasties before the destruction of its Jewish community by the Almohads, 1050. It was an important center of Jewish civilization. This is confirmed by the well-known Andalusian poet and Rabbi Abraham ibn Esra, 1092-1167, who wrote that it was a city of sages and Guonim who maintained constant contact with the Talmudic schools of Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Morocco, and Spain. From the 11th to the 13th century under Almoravid, 1070-1147, and Almohad, 1130-1269, rule, the political unification of the Western Maghreb was followed by the establishment of rigid Islamic law and the creation of a homogeneous religious society that gradually extinguished any particularism. The Almohads were merciless toward the Jews who refused to convert to Islam. After a century of Almohad persecution, numerous Jewish communities had ceased to exist. Abraham ibn Esra recounted in his elegy, Ahad Yarad, the extent of the disaster that fell on the Jews of Karwan, Tzafaks, Gabes, and Meknes, who were massacred just before those of Fez and Marrakesh. Even though the deterioration of the Jewish condition was not entirely uniform, from the time Almoravid authorities took control of North African trade by supervising all axes of communication, the situation was particularly unfavorable to the commerce of northern Jews who turned to trade with India without entirely abandoning Saharan routes. Okay. On the Algerian-Moroccan border, according to a local chronicle discovered at the beginning of the 20th century by the French A.G.P. Martin, the very earliest Jewish inhabitants of Tawat and Gurara settled in the 1st century A.D., coming from Sarneka, and were followed by a second wave of settlers who arrived with Arab traders from Mosul. The making of Fagara underground water pipes in Tawat, based on a model that previously existed in Mesopotamia, confirms that this know-how seems to have originated from Persia and to date back to very ancient antiquity. They were mentioned as far back as the 5th century BC in Herodotus. Another tradition from the region of Tugurt in the northeast of Tuat reveals that the Jewish population is so ancient that they are considered the earliest white inhabitants of the area. In the most ancient period, whose tradition was conserved by memory, the country was inhabited by Jews, the later Jews who employed Negro workers and who owned kasars and palm groves. One day, a man of the Bnei Mehrin named Al-Hajj Slimane al-Merini al-Jelabi came from the Maghreb. It was around the 7th century, 14th century AD. Several years after his arrival, he issued an edict stipulating that within 3 days, all of the Jews had to become Muslims or leave that country. Most of them emigrated, and those who remained were named Mehajerin, expatriates. The Mehajerin are of Jewish race. They are the last descendants of the ancient Jews of Tuat, and although they became Muslims, they continue to live and marry among themselves. This supports the allegation of G. Rolfs. Excuse me, this page just flipped on me. This supports the allegation of G. Rolfs, a German explorer who met these people in the 19th century, and specified that they say that they are descendants of Jews, but there is no evidence to confirm this origin. One can believe it because of the mixing with black populations. In Tuat, the gateway to Sudan, the Jewish community was very active up to the 15th century, as the Telemaken Tout Niger Trail was one of the main routes for Saharan trade. Tawat was also linked to Central Maghreb by the Mazab Trail, with its Jewish communities of Ouargla and Touggourt. In 1447, Antonio Malfante, a Genovese Christian, undertook a voyage to Tawat. The letter he wrote during his stay between Telemekin and Tamentit is of great interest as regards the presence and prosperity of Jews in these regions at that time. Here Jews abound, they live in peace, under the rule of various masters, each of whom defends his subordinates. They thus have a very peaceful social life. Trade is practiced here through there. And let's just go up here before we turn the page. This is a map of North and West African regions concerned by a Jewish presence in the Middle Ages. Okay, you can take a look at that. All across Africa, we had a Jewish presence of original Jews. Look at this. Look at all this history that was never told. Look at all this. Look at all these groups of original Jewish peoples across Africa. Look at this. It's a wonderful thing to let this knowledge be told. Okay, so let's start again from here. Here Jews abound, they live in peace under the rule of various masters, each of whom defends his subordinates. They thus have a very peaceful social life. Trade is practiced here through their intermediary, and there are several who can be wholly trusted. This territory is a stopover point in Moorish country where merchants bring and sell their goods. The gold brought here is purchased from those who come from the coast. The Arabs bring grain and barley here, which is sold all year long, but they have fierce enemies whose territory they do not dare cross, the Philistines. Philistines is the name given by Malfante to the Tuareg, whose attacks reduced the number of caravans heading south, and it is possible to deduce that the Jews who attempted to cross Tuareg territories were heading for Sudan. Leo Africanus's testimony is the best source of information on the status of the Jews in the provinces bordering West Africa, as well as on their travels. He tells us that at the beginning of the 16th century, Jewish merchants and craftsmen were living in the Wadi Nun, where the great annual gathering of Moroccan caravans took place. The caravans that go to Timbuktu and Walata in the country of the blacks, as in Tuyat and Tedsi, where the importance of Jews in economic life is such that they are not submitted to any tribute, the jizya. They simply have to give some gifts to the nobleman. He also specified that in the neighboring city of Tedsi, about 20 kilometers from Taraudant, there live many Jewish workers such as goldsmiths and ironsmiths, and that this city welcomed the people who practiced trade with the country of the blacks. Leo Africanus also noted the presence in the Dra of many Jewish traders, craftsmen, and goldsmiths. On the route from Fez to Tombuctu, as well as in the Falalian Kusars of Tabu Samt, and Al-Ma'mum, and provided interesting indications about their travels. There are some rich gentlemen, Jews, and many of them go to the country of the blacks, whence they bring back goods from Berberia, which they trade for golden slaves. In the Geris, Jewish traders passing through were the only ones who had to pay a tax excuse me, I lost track here. The destruction of the synagogue, this Jewish community would have been condemned in 1492 by the decision of Sheikh Abd al-Karim al-Mekili, who offered 7 mithqals of gold to whoever would kill a Jew, and ordered the destruction of the synagogue of Tementit and the other synagogues of Tuat. While some Jews could have fled northward or westward, some of the survivors would have been able to go farther south of the Sahara toward the kingdom of Gao along the caravan routes. Soon after, we learn from Leo Africanus that under the influence of the same al-Mekili, Muhammad the Great, ruler of Songhai, made an edict to expel the Jews from his kingdom, and that Jews were obliged to either apostatize or die. It seems that the policy of Askia Muhammad was to put an end to all Jewish presence in the Niger basin, but such measures against the Jews make sense only if Jews were numerous in the area. There is evidence for the presence of Jews from ancient times in the Dred, in Tozer, Nafwasa, and Matmata, on the border between Tunisia and Tripolitania. Gadames accommodated an ancient Jewish community whose existence is referred to in rabbinic texts. In rabbinic texts. In the Djelbel Nafusa, vestiges of a Jewish quarter were discovered in the city of Sharus, which was crossed by the Tripoli-Sudan caravan trail. According to the Al-Bakri, in the 11th century in the Juadu, the starting point of the trail of the Kanem via the Fezan, there lived a large population of Jews. Another piece of information is provided by Benjamin of Tudela, who left us a few lines dating from around 1173 about their caravan journeys to Black Africa. It is a 12-day journey from Aswan to Halwan, where there are some 300 Jews. From there, they travel for 50 days by caravan through the great desert called Sahara to the city of Zavila called Havila in the scriptures, into the land of Ghana. This land is located on the western side of Kush, which is called Al-Hasba. All this plausibly suggests an uninterrupted chain of Jewish colonies up to the border of the Sahara, scattered from the Atlantic Ocean to the Libyan desert, whose economic life and longevity depended at least in part on the trans-Saharan trade. One can suppose that the Jews of Saharan caravans who traveled down toward Senegal and Niger were certain to meet communities of co-religionists, which enabled them to endure the insecurity of their travels and separation from their traditions. The importance of the trans-Saharan trade, which, as in the Tuat, constituted the main resource of its Jewish inhabitants, led them to ask the rabbis the rabbis of Algiers to study the religious problems with the peddlers who confronted as regards the question of the risk of profanation of the Shabbat. The rabbinic jurisprudence in matters of trans-Saharan trade, the responsa, constitutes an important testimony of a Jewish presence in the Saharan confines, because the rabbis were required to create specific rulings on the risk of desecration of the Sabbath due to desert crossings. For those who cannot leave the caravan on the weekly day of rest, Rabbi Isaac bar Sheshet Barfa 1326-1408 made the decision, which became law, to authorize caravaneers to continue their travel during Shabbat under the condition that they begin the travel at least 3 days before. Okay. If Jews participated in the trans-Saharan trade, did they have access to Sudanese trade centers? And did they found their lineage? Arab sources and certain traditions of West Africa suggest that they did. A Jewish presence in Mauritania and Sudan in the Middle Ages. In Mauritania, according to Arab sources and certain oral traditions of Western Africa, the first inhabitants of Western Africa were the Bafour, whose Jewish origin is enigmatic and controversial. Following a process of organization, functioning, and decline of all Sudanese empires described by Charles Montel, one might assume that a Bafour empire existed several centuries before Islam. These Bafour seem to have introduced the cultivation of palm trees, horse breeding, new irrigation methods, and metallurgy. According to a tradition reported by Andre J. Lucas, the Bafour were the first ones to plant palm trees and to dig deep and large wells. The Mu'almin craftsmen make and have always made works of art. They are called Yahud, because according to legend, only Jews in Mauritania were craftsmen. And you know that the Mu'almin have neither homeland nor tribe. This tradition is also mentioned in the Kartas of Ibn Abizar, who noted the presence of Jews in Arab origin in a place called Teklesen, which resisted the Almoravids in the Middle Ages. According to Ibn Abizar, the name of Wangara designated both the region located on the Upper Senegal and its inhabitants. These people waged war against the Sanhaja neighbors, who were Berbers converted to Islam. These tribes lived in the neighborhood of Teklesen. They were Arabs and practiced the Jewish religion. Al-Idrisi's testimony informs us that the Bafour spread out in the west of Mauritania and on the Atlantic coast when they were persecuted by the Almoravids. To this important Bafour dispersion of the Judaized blacks of Adrar, and Tagnat, one must add that the before fraction that lives on fish on the coast. Al-Idrisi summarized the situation of some of these groups at the time following the Almoravids. Only a small group of people from Kamnuria remain, scattered between these deserts and near the coast and living off dairy products or fish. They lead a hard and precarious life. They wander in this territory. According to Charles Montel, the repression first by the Almoravids, the Almoravids, then more pronouncedly in the 16th century, pushed a part of the Judaized Bafour to the south of the Senegal River, where they are thought to have merged with the Wolof populations and were named Sebe Baor by the Pule. The oral tradition that presents the fishermen of the more Mauritanian coast, the Imraguen, Shnagla, and Aulid Ahmed ben Dakmen as descendants of ancient Bafour, corroborates Al-Idrisi's account and observes noted that they conceal their Jewish origin. Al-Idrisi provides us substantial information about the presence of Jews near the country of gold in western Sudan or present-day Mali. There are only 2 cities in this land of Lam, which are not larger than villages. One is called Mala and the other Dar. According to the people of this region, the inhabitants are Jews, but most of them are submerged in impiety and ignorance. He adds, the inhabitants of Kamnuria, following these sayings of merchants, claim to be Jews. Their beliefs are a mixture of everything. They are nothing and have no well-established belief. Information from his contemporary Al-Zuhri, who probably quoted his predecessor's work, supports the account of Al-Idrisi. The inhabitants of Karafoun in the region of Timbuktu follow the Jewish religion. One can get there from Gao and Wargla. They can read the Torah. They import silk cloth, saffron, tinted goods, tar, cowries, pearls. It is tempting to merge this information about a Jewish presence in the south of Sahara with the tradition of Eldad the Danite, who in the 9th century claimed that Jewish tribes ruled these regions. However, this claim has been strongly challenged by Raymond Mowney, who consider that these black groups were probably Soninke, who were conquered and dispersed by the neighboring Berbers, and who were not really Islamicized in the time of Al-Idrisi. It is therefore not surprising that, a century later, they are presented as professing a religion that was a mixture of all sort of things, and that is, they were not considered as Muslims by the Arabs, and not wanting to be called heathens so as to avoid the fate reserved by Islam for idolaters. These Soninke simply declared themselves as Jews, thus people of the book, and as such were only subject to special tax. The Karaj, whereas had they been called heathens, and they would sooner or later have been condemned to slavery. One remark is nonetheless necessary regarding Mowney's reflections. To call themselves Jews suggests that the Soninke must have had some knowledge of Jews in the south of the Sahara. The Tariq al-Fatash also mentions the existence of a colony of Banu Israel living at Tedrima in the southeast of Timbuktu, in the place where the city of Tendirma was founded in 1496. An Israelite population had formerly lived, whose wells and tombs still remain. These Jews who inhabited the place until the 15th century lived on agriculture and had dug wells because they grew vegetables which they sold, and for which merchants paid them considerable amounts of money. The small Jewish colony would have been condemned in the 15th century by the decision taken at the instigation of al-Makili, who already exterminated the Jews from Tuat and convinced the Askia Muhammad, the ruler of Timbuktu, forbidding Jews to enter his territory, which at that time covered the entire Sahelian region. The evidence of later travelers supports the existence of a Jewish presence in West Africa. At the end of the 18th century, the Scottish explorer Mungo Park noted that the presence of Jews in the region of Timbuktu under the protection of the Tuareg and Moors, from whom they were indistinguishable, it seems that they practiced Islam in appearance only, and that they ensured their ethnic continuity through endogamy and endogamy. Mungo Park's testimony is supported by a later 19th century source, Mardochi Abi Serar, a traveling rabbi and a travel companion of Charles de Foucauld, was offered hospitality by a tribe, the Dagatun, who lived among the Al-Limeden Tuareg and who claimed to be of Jewish origin. This group, which was settled in a territory extending from the Air to the Niger River by way of the Adrar of Ifora, did not mix with the other subjects of Al-Limeden Tuareg. They freely asserted their ancient Jewish identity before the Al-Meden, of whom they were vassals. The testimony of the Dagatun, whose customs otherwise show no trace of Jewish traditions, recalls the epic of the Tuati Jews and their possible dispersal in the desert. Aside from the picturesqueness of Marduchi's account, nothing enables us to determine their origin, any more than the origin of other groups living among the Tuareg, such as the Ida al-Shaq or the Sahak, sons of Isaac or Isaac, the Igdalin, the Inhaden, reputed to be of Jewish origin. According to Henry Lot, the Inhaden are descendants of the Jews of Tuat, where they practiced the craft of smiths and jewelers. The Inhaden are the artisan caste of the Tuareg. Enad means the other, and by extension, the one who is not named. The Tuareg, for them, also became of the supernatural powers. Witchcraft and magic they attribute to them. These tribes could stem from portions of the Jewish Toati people who found refuge with the Tuareg. Or is it possible that there were descendants of Jewish caravaneers raided in the desert? We shall see later that the massacre of the Tuati Jews and the refuge that some survivors found in the region of Timbuktu shaped the popular consciousness and gave rise to local myths of groups who claimed to be descendants of Tuati Jews. Further south in the Sudan, the existence of a small Jewish community is noted by Valentin Fernandez in the beginning of the 16th century. In his description, yes, In Walata, there were very rich and oppressed Jews who are either peddlers or goldsmiths or jewelers. In another passage, Fernandez also tells of the presence of Jews farther west. In this country, Jalofa or Wolof country, Gailofa or Wolof country, and in Mandinga, there are Jews, and they are called Gaul, and they are black like the people of the country. However, they do not have synagogues and do not practice the ceremonies of other Jews. They live separately from the other blacks in their villages. These Gaul are often jesters. Then follows a description of the griots, a marginal caste in Western Africa, which suggests a confusion of Fernandez between Jews and griots. Mani tells us that the term for griot is gaulo. Is gaulo, kind of sounds like gala in Peul, which supports the confusion, even if Fernandez's testimony found an echo in the writings of J. Munzer, who affirmed in 1500. Some of them, blacks, are Jewish. They are called Garol in their language and are much hated. The most obvious evidence, however, of the economic activity of the North African Jews, of their role in the trans-Saharan trade, and their presence in sub-Saharan Africa is found in the Majorcan Jewish geographers' portolans of the 14th and 15th centuries. In the 14th and 15th centuries, in the Balearic Islands, a center of studies flourished that provided scientific equipment for navigators such as astrolabes, compasses, astrolabes, compasses, and world maps. Majorcan cartographers Angelino Dulcert, Abraham and Yehuda Crescus, Messia of Villadestis, and Petrus Rosselli were all Jewish or of Jewish origin. It seems likely that links existed between Spanish Jews, particularly those of Balearic Islands, and the core religionists of the Saharan edge of Africa. Charles de la Roncière informs us, when the Majorcans began to make maps in the 14th century, they had first-hand information on the interior of the Black Continent, where other Jews were trading from South Moroccan or Algerian cities with the countries situated in the south of Sahara, and particularly the Empire of Mali. In 1339, Angelo Dulcert's map revealed the location of Mali and Walata, as well as the existence of a Rex Meli rich in gold, while the Catalan Atlas of Abraham Cresquis, 1375, indicated the location of Timbuktu. For de la Roncière, who devoted himself to a comparison of the maps developed during the Middle Ages, the astonishing precision of details provided by Majorcan geographers could only come from their Saharan informers, the Jewish caravaneers who traveled back and forth across the desert. Their maps were not limited to a political description of the countries located south of the Sahara, based on Arab geographers. When we examine the maps of Africa produced by Majorcan workshops and compare them with Arabian maps, we can immediately see an essential difference. The formal detailed caravan routes and familiar routes to Jews, whereas the latter are designed for political purposes. Majorcan maps have a flexibility of expression that attests to close contact with reality. exhibiting very clear advances in comparison with former maps. Majorcan Portalins gave detailed information about the main caravan routes and the names of the main Saharan and Sudanese sites. Thus, in 1439, Angelino du Sert was able to locate Meli, as well as the Walata, Hulatem. His planisphere also indicates the trail connecting Sijilmasa to Walata via Buda in Tuat, which was used only as of the 14th century for safety reasons. The high point of knowledge on the interior of the African continent was reached with the Catalan Atlas by Abraham Cresques, which was used in large part by Messias of Villadestis 1413 and Gabriel of Valesha ibn Krish 1439, departing from the Dra, which is crossed by the traders who enter the land of the Guinea's Negroes. Cresques went down to the Sahara, a region inhabited by people who covered mouths and who make caravans with camels. Tagaost is the first step of the voyage towards the country of Mausameli Mali, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea, the richest and noblest king of the whole region. So abounds the gold in his country. This Catalan Atlas also indicates the stopping points of the Sijilmasa Timbuktu Trail via Tagaza and the location of Gao and Sokoto, Zogde. When the Jewish cartographic school of the Balearic Islands flourished, it seems that the Jews knew the Sahara and Sudan quite well and had traveled throughout their territories. This is confirmed by the testimony of Arab travelers. The involvement of Jews in trans-Saharan trade appears undeniable, even if it is not possible to assess whether small groups of isolated individuals could have founded a line of descent in Sahara or Sudan. Their banishment from the region of Songhai at the end of the 15th century, mentioned by Leo Africanus, seems to provide confirmation of the presence in Sudan, in a territory that would now include the southern part of Mauritania, the Niger Basin, and the east of Senegal. Conclusions about earlier periods are highly speculative. One might hypothesize that the part of the Judeo-Berber populations were Judaized before the arrival of Arab Muslims in the 17th century, and that these groups did not all adhere to Islam. One might also consider that Jewish groups, having imprecise contours, had a long-standing presence in Ghana and Mali until the destruction by the Almoravids in the 11th century. Furthermore, if we take into account sources showing that Jewish traders and caravaneers did indeed crisscross the Sahara, we can imagine how a kind of mythology of African Judaism might have been created. Further, it is possible that centuries of Islamization would not necessarily obliterate some legacy of Judaism among the groups descended from these ancient Jews. In this case, some traces of Jewish culture might have survived in the subterranean memory of individuals or groups, as suggested in general by Freud. This mental process, which is similar to Freud's return of the repressed, by which repressed elements are never entirely destroyed and reappear in a distorted way, might be at work and reveal surviving elements linked to ancient and repressed Jewish traditions. Traces of Judaism were found in the 1950s among these populations by Charles Montel, who asserts that the Marabouts possessed Jewish books translated into Arabic, which they used as a source of occult science. Montel also collected a number of legends, which according to him have a direct Hebrew origin, and he noted that the most noble and most humble fractions of the Sudanese people still assert that they are descendants of Jews. Knowing the inclination of colonial agents to perceive Judaism in unlikely places, it is advisable to remain cautious about such assertions. Knowing the inclination of colonial agents to perceive Judaism in unlikely places, it is advisable to remain cautious about such assertions. This debate has recently been reopened. Dirk Lange, a professor of African history at the University of Bayreuth, Germany, in Ancient Kingdoms of West Africa, Africa-Centered and Canaanite Israelite Perspective, 2004, using hitherto unexplored sources, presents the development of the West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai from a new perspective of ethnogenesis. He maintains that the main clan and state structures of several West African kingdoms are based on the same dualistic patterns as that of the Canaanite Israelite, and hence also Phoenician societies. The Fan peoples of Benin were the Phoenicians. Also Phoenician societies. Supported by written records, oral traditions, and cult dramatic performances, these similarities suggest the existence of early trans-Saharan contacts reaching back to the pre-Roman period. The Phoenician trade appears to have been the single most important factor explaining the transfer of these organizational forms from North Africa to the sub-Saharan region, where they could be particularly prominent in the Hausa and Yoruba societies. The Hausa and Yoruba traditions are considered by Lang as a phenomenon of longue durée that can be traced back to an Israelite model based on Canaanite antecedents. According to Lang, similar social institutions were transmitted from the Semitic world to the Horn of Africa as a result of the ancient myrrh and frankincense trade, and some of these polities grew so powerful that they conquered and controlled a number of kingdoms in West and East Africa. Although these ideas have been branded as diffusionist and Hamitic, Lang's approach to Africa's regional history is a bold attempt to place East and West Africa's kingdoms in the context of ancient Near Eastern history and culture. Lang's hypotheses represent a real challenge to the present paradigm of African history and open up new perspectives for research. Okay. A Jewish presence on the West African coast and islands. Okay. Excuse me there. A Jewish presence on the West African coast and islands. The Cape Verde Islands, which had been discovered between 1455 and 1462, were from 1472 essentially a slave trading place, restricted to an exclusive monopoly of the Portuguese crown. Despite the important role of Portuguese Jews in commerce, navigation, and cartography of Africa as early as 1480, they faced profound oppression during the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, when they became termed marranos or Judeos segredos, secret Jews. It was, however, in 1492 that the Spanish Inquisition developed its fullest expression of anti-Semitism, which quickly spread to Portugal. In 1496, King Manuel I of Portugal decided to exile thousands of Jews to Sao Tome, Principe, and Cape Verde. Those who were not expelled were converted by force or executed. In the 16th century, during the persecution of the Jews in Portugal, an entire colony came to settle in Cape Verde, despite the opposition of Philip III of Spain, then King of Portugal. Despite their exile in degradado convict status, the small number of Europeans and Jews residing in Cape Verde were allowed to engage in trade, as long as they did not compete with the world trading monopolies. The crown in the 16th and 17th centuries encouraged the traders, converts, or expelled Jews from Portugal to settle along the Senegambia and Upper Guinea coast to trade for ivory, hide, slaves, gold, gum, wax, and amber while based in Cape Verde. Those traders, usually called lanzados, were often, but not always, of Jewish origin. The term lanzados derives from the Portuguese verb for to throw out and is related to outcast or fugitive roles in Portuguese African coastal commerce. Christian lanzados were also known, most of them being fugitives for some political crime. By the early 1600s, Cape Verdean lanzados had trading centers all along the Senegambian coast at places such as Gori and Jual, a Portuguese town in Gambia, and Ziguinchor in the Casamance, and farther down the Guinea coast. In 1614, the governor of Cape Verde recorded that the greatest number of lanzados were Jews. Jews from Cape Verde and Portugal were already known in Jual as early as 1591, and a synagogue was noted there in 1641 by Jorge de Castillo, governor of Cape Verde. In 1606, in Portugal, and according to Father Baltazar Barreda, on the Senegalese coast, there were 100 Portuguese, following the law of Moses. In 1622, the Cape Verdean governor, Dom Francisco de Moura, reported to the Portuguese king that the Guinea coastal rivers were full of Jews who were masters of the local regions and were quite independent of the crown. In the 17th century, while retaining their bases in the Cape Verde Islands and in Guinea, the Portuguese withdrew from Senegambia. During this period, the term Ganogoga, which named people who were able to speak many local languages, was used in the Upper Guinea and Cape Verde region to imply Jewish lanzados. Even if the anti-Semitism of Spain and Portugal and the financial interests of the Portuguese crown were constantly trying to restrict their success, Jewish lanzados played a central role in the economy and society because of their collaborative relation with African cultures and the fact that they had African wives. Their multiracial and multicultural identity contributed widely to the cultural linguistic mixture that constitutes the Cape Verdean Creole culture. In 1698, a testimony of the French traveler Lemaire confirmed the intermixing of Jews with the local population, the second generation being more mixed and superficially converted to Catholicism. Other than these three groups, there is one that is a kind of Portuguese, mulattoes, because people call them so because they had served them in the past and because they are descendants of the first inhabitants of this coast. From the Negro women they married, mulattoes were born. As they follow the religion of their former masters, they are part Jew, part Catholic, not more one than the other. Historically, Jews first came to the land of Sao Tiago during the Inquisition and were confined to a separate community in Praia. From the 19th century, other Jews of Moroccan origin joined this colony. There are still traces of their presence in the village of Santo Antão, located on the northern coast, where a village named Synagoga evokes an ancient Jewish presence. A number of steles with Hebrew inscriptions discovered in the Boa Vista and the Ponta da Sol cemeteries indicates that Jews, probably immigrants from Morocco, lived on this island in the 19th century. Some of their descendants left it after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, leaving behind a mixed population with Jewish Moroccan patronymics. Traces of a Jewish presence are to be found too in Sao Tome. The Sao Tome Islands were discovered in 1472, probably devoid of native populations, during an expedition by two Portuguese pilots, João de Santarém and Pedro de Escobar. It was only in 1485 that the Portuguese king became interested in them and took measures to encourage settlers. It seems that King John II then offered the Jews of his kingdom the alternative of converting to Catholicism or immigrating to Sao Tome. Reed wrote, John II of Portugal in 1484, finding that the climate of San Torme was so unhealthy, gave the Jews in his kingdom the agreeable choice of being baptized or of colonizing San Torme and marrying women brought over from Angola. From this union arose a mixed race, which the Portuguese firmly perpetuated. King Manuel of Portugal, seeking funds to finance his program of colonial expansion, imposed huge taxes on the Jews with very little time to pay. When it was seen that there was very little likelihood that the majority of the Jews would pay the tax, the king deported their young children to Sao Tome and Principe. 2,000 Jewish children, boys and girls no more than 8 years old, were separated from their parents and deported there, where the majority of them died from starvation and illnesses. We learn from sources that Álvaro de Campina, the governor of Sao Tome, managed to save 600 children by sending them with African nannies to the island of Principe and to Rio. Nevertheless, a testimony of Francisco Coelho in 1669 asserts that afterward the Jews who lived in these islands enjoyed a certain freedom. They are assigned the introduction of cocoa coming from Brazil in Prince Island and Sao Tome, and without real evidence, they practice some local dietary restrictions. They use the 6 branches star as a magic sign of Nigeria and some features of Kabbalistic numerology, some ritual details. The presence of descendants of Jews in Sao Tome up to the 20th century is supported by the testimony of M.W.D. Jeffries, an official who completed an assignment in the region in 1936. Jeffrey reported that there existed a small group undistinguishable from the others, but who claimed a separate origin. They claimed to be of Jewish descent. Their names were not particularly Jewish, and though their males were circumcised, that did not set them apart because the males of the other groups were also circumcised. They were also light complexioned. He added, the story of these natives had a substratum of truth. They no doubt were descendants of the Jewish colonists settled on Sao Tome some 350 years earlier. Several evidences confirm too the presence of Jewish Lancados or of their descendants on the coast of Western Africa. A 17th century text by Francisco de Lemos Coelho on the description of the coast of Guinea indicates that many Jews born in Portugal lived there, owning very large houses, and went there to practice their religion because the kings of the country protected them, and in fact, because they could not be punished. Coelho also reports that in Rufisque, Senegal, many Jews, some of whom came from the north, owned trading houses, and that they were rather disdained by both Africans and residents. They also paid more taxes than the other whites, but they were resigned to do so in order to live according to the laws. They left descendants in this country, resulting from relation with negresses, who were Jewish like themselves, but thanks to divine mercy, they converted to the Catholic Church in my time. Among the travelers who noted a Jewish presence on the coast of Guinea, John Ogilvy wrote in a book on Africa published in 1679, many Jews are also scattered over this region. Some natives, boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabit both parts of the river Niger. Others are Asian strangers who fled thither either from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian, or from Judea, wasted and depopulated by Romans, Persians, citizens, and Christians, or else such as came out of Europe whence they were banished. In the 19th century, David Livingstone reported a colony of educated blacks 200 miles in the interior of St. Paul and Luanda in Ambaka, whom he called Jews of Angola. This region, like Sao Tome, had the function of being a colony for undesirable Portuguese of all kind. These Jews of Angola were remarkable traders, esteemed as clerks and writers, and they knew well the history of Portugal and Portuguese laws. Their commercial expeditions took them hundred of miles into the interior of the country, and they knew the region long before the arrival of the Jesuits, who paid little attention to the presence of Jews in this area. On the Cabinda coast in Portuguese West Africa, another black group called the Mavumba, recognized as renowned potters, was considered by Ratzel as descendants of Jews expelled from Portugal and deported to Sao Tome. In his work on the groups claiming a lost tribe's origin, Godbey mentions that Adolf Bastian, who participated in the German Laongo expedition of 1873-1876 on the coast of Congo, observed blacks who were called Judeos by the Portuguese, he found among them certain characteristics generally assigned to Jews, and described them as grave and reserved when compared to other blacks, and wealthy because they control most of the trade. Nonetheless, Godbey stresses what he calls the aberrations of ethnologists in search of Semitic or white characteristics in African populations. In particular, he recalls the medieval legislation whereby a slave could, at that time, earn his freedom by acquiring the religion of his owner. Anti-Jewish legislation in Spain and Portugal, the Siete Partidas, or Seven Codes of Alphonse X, 1250 to 1280, aimed, among other things, to limit Jewish proselytism. Moreover, we forbid any Jew should dare to make his slave turn Jew, although the slave be a Moor or of any other barbarous people. But should it be done, the slave who has been a Jew or Jewess shall be free and withdrawn from the owner. Any slave could thus earn his freedom by adopting the Jewish religion. The interpretation of this ban and its consequences supports the hypothesis of the existence of Africans who became Jewish, emancipated, and without white ancestry, who would have later spread toward neighboring coasts. A compilation of testimonies gathered by a certain Lucian Wolf seems to demonstrate the same custom of proselytism in the Canary Islands. In the minutes of trials taking place between 1499 and 1667, one can find the testimony of a black slave claiming that the employers tried to terrify her into the slaves terrify her into adopting their Jewish customs. Another slave asserts that when he was asked why did he not work on Saturday as other days, he replied that his master had ordered him to do nothing. And he adds that his master took his two young brothers, one 15 and the other between 16 and 18, and that they were taught Jewish laws. Another indication comes from the sentence of a Guinean black named Pedro Alvarez, who was tried at the age of 100 because he asserted that all men should be circumcised. The judgment handed down in this case was such an error in a Negro and of the age of 100 deserved exemplary punishment had he not died during the process and thus escaped punishment. The presence of Jewish traders and mixed race traders living with African communities in the islands and on the West Africa coast seems to be a short chapter in the history of these regions. In the context of the merging and blending of Iberian, Moorish, Jewish, and African peoples, Portuguese land of coast Jews may have introduced a certain degree of knowledge of Judaism in the Creole culture of subsequent generations. Half-caste descendants of the Lancados used free servants or slaves to help them. Considering the Siete Partidas of Alfonso X, Judaism could have steadily spread by proselytizing African slaves. This suggests long historical roots, which can continue to play a role in the survival of Jewish cultural identity in these regions and elsewhere. Due to the Atlantic slave trade, there could probably be African Portuguese populations in the Caribbean islands, similar to and linked with those in Africa. The wealth, the religious freedom, higher instructional level, and proselytism of the Jews may have been interacting influences that nurtured the myth of Jewish ancestry among some African American Jewish societies and sowed the seeds of Black Jew movements. Okay, we're going to stop here. This is a pretty long chapter, so we're just going to pause right here and continue with possible references to Hebrew Semitic traces in Southeast Africa. Okay, and remember, through all these readings of different Jewish populations that came to Africa and may have showed them things, or may have showed them a different way. The true Jews, I wouldn't say a different way, but different Jewish communities that went into Africa. The true Jews always have been and always will be Black African descendants. So we will continue with possible references to Hebrew Semitic traces in South Africa and Southeast Africa later. So give thanks for tuning in. Salam.